A pleasant day to everyone. Welcome to our discussion when it comes to Earth's climate for our subject Earth Science. And for today, we will simply be talking about the different things that are actually related when it comes to this certain type of meteorological phenomenon. So whenever we're talking about the Earth's climate, the main focus or the main branch of Earth Science that is responsible for the study of the Earth's climate, it is known as climatology. So first, what is climate? So climate is simply the average weather in a locality over a long period and is determined within a number of years. So these are actually determined within 1, 2, 3 years or even a decade for them to see the different patterns that are present in these specific locations. What could be the possible reason regarding the different changes that is happening on different variables, just like the presence of temperature? Is the temperature this optimum or this minimum when it comes to this specific months? You're observing this pattern. Even the amount of precipitation that is present every single month. Even the air pressure, wind sustained in decades or even longer. So whenever we are talking about the different things that are related with climate, these are actually observed by a lot of climatologists for a very long period of time. Because for us to establish the climate of a specific region or a specific place, we should always observe what simply happened in the past. Okay, so in the case of the climate, it will always be about the discussion or the observations of those different types of changes that happen in the atmosphere for a long period of time. So, there are actually different factors that are affecting climate. So let's simply start with the first one. Do you know that the land and water differences can actually affect the climate present in an area? So for instance, that location is very near from the sea. So basically, that location could experience wetter and colder climate, while the ones that are actually present inland or locked by different bodies of land, that location could actually be considered as a location possessing very hot or high temperature or very dry temperature or very dry climate. And since we are talking about the sea, the other thing that can actually affect weather it is via ocean current. So ocean current can actually either increase or reduce the temperature present in a location, simply because the movement of water can either start to dissipate the temperature that is simply absorbed by the water when there is the interaction with sunlight. Okay, so whenever the water is actually moving, because of the presence of pressure and even the presence of wind, it can actually start to release the heat that is simply absorbed by the surface of it when it came in contact with the radiation that is coming from the sun. But if the ocean currents aren't that high or aren't that fast, there's a possibility that the surface temperature will be hotter and it will lead to hotter climate. Okay? So in some cases, ocean currents are also some of the reasons for the presence of El Nino phenomenon. But we're going to talk about more on the El Nino phenomenon or the video presentation that I will be providing, additional video presentation that I will be providing when it comes to that discussion. So the next one, there's also the presence of the direction of so remember that the wind can always bring different types of weather disturbances. So it could be in a form of a storm, thunderstorm, and even some typhoon, depending upon the different things that is simply happening in the atmosphere at that very moment. After the sunlight that the equator, specifically the region in the tropics, are experiencing, that's the reason why there's a lot of precipitation or there's also the presence of very hot and very dry climate when it comes to the areas that are very near to the equator. So remember that the sun's radiation is the reason for the different heating up at the same time when it comes to the um, even the presence of a lot of precipitation that is present on bodies of water. It's still because of the interaction of the sun's radiation which is heating up the surface of the earth. Okay? Because unlike the temperate and the polar regions, the sunlight is simply directed towards the equator. Okay? Then also there is the presence of the topography or the altitude of a specific location. Whenever we are talking about the topography, it is now the time when we can observe that mountainous regions are possessing colder temperature than the ones that are present in the lower slope or in the lower portion or in the lowlands. So mountainous regions are regions with heavy precipitations, while usually when it comes to the sheltered or leeward side or on the other side of that cliff or of that mountain, the temperature or the climate is quite dry because majority of the moisture was simply lost in the air when it rained down or the precipitation fell down on the mountainous regions. That's the reason why in Antipolo, even in Baguio City, Mountain Province, Kalinga, and even in Ifugao and in Tagaytay. Okay, so these are the different locations where we can observe that the topography is quite high. The altitude is quite high, so that's the reason why the temperature is quite cold, and the precipitation that is present there is somewhat abundant. Okay, so these are the different factors that can affect the climate. But if we're going to talk about the larger scale, which is all about the whole Earth, then climate was actually classified into three different zones. The climate that is present on the very hot zone or the torrid zone, which is very near to the equator. Then the frigid zone, which is now the one that is actually present on the polar caps or the Arctic and Antarctic region. While in the case of the temperate zone, it is now in between the tropics and the polar region. So basically, this is the basic classification of climate, but nowadays we are now using different classifications for it. So we can actually classify them if they are tropical, dry, moderate, continental, and even polar. So when it comes to the different classifications of climate, we are actually going to use the German-based classification of climate, which is the Köppen climate classification. According to this, there are 5 major types of climate that is present around the Earth, and they are actually subcategorized into other different types depending upon the location, depending upon the amount of precipitation and the likes. But in general, on the Earth, there are 5 basic types of climate according to Köppen climate classification. So if we're going to consider here the different types of climates, when it comes to the tropical climate, 22.2% of the whole coverage of the Earth is actually possessing tropical climate, while 32.2% of the total landmass on Earth, it is possessing dry climate. When it comes to the 16.5%, it is now the temperate climate. The 24% of the Earth land masses, it is possessing continental climate, while in the case of the 5.1%, it is now the polar climate. So basically, these are the different climate classifications according to Köppen, and let's simply discuss every single one of them. Starting off with the tropical climate, where the Philippines is included. So when it comes to the tropical climate, it is also known as a megathermal climate, since this is now actually the time when the temperature that is present in this location is being influenced because of their nearness to the equator. And at the same time, the tropical climate, it is also the time when the average temperature does 18 degrees Celsius and higher. So those are actually the, let's simply say, the average temperature that is present in this specific location, including in the Philippines, which could actually range up to around 30 degrees Celsius depending upon the temperature or depending upon the season. Then, there is actually very high annual precipitation when it comes to the tropical region, and it is simply because of the presence of the very high temperature that is situated near the equator. So that's the reason why there's the presence of high annual precipitation. Then, the different things that are actually present in the climate of the tropical region can simply be classified into either the tropical rainforest, tropical monsoon, or even a tropical savanna. So those are actually some of the things that we should know when it comes to the this certain type of climate. Now, when it comes to the second classification of climate that is present on the world, that is the dry or desert or semi-arid climates. So when it comes to this particular climates, these are now characterized by very low precipitation. That is the reason why the temperatures are very high and that's very hot. Specifically, these are the different desert areas, which is the first type of arid climate. While the second one, there is the presence of arid or the steep different locations. So majority of these different locations are desert areas. Okay, and life here is quite hard, specifically if we're going to consider the organisms that are thriving or living in this area. So the dry classification, it is now the majority of the land masses on Earth is possessing this type of climate classification. Okay, so other than the presence of the dry climate, let's now proceed with the temperate climate. When it comes to the temperate climate, majority of Europe is actually experiencing this type of climate. So when it comes to the temperate climate, it is now the point when the temperature is roughly around 0 degrees Celsius to 18 degrees Celsius. So this is now the average temperature of these specific locations, which also includes some parts of eastern China, the presence of Japan, even some parts of Sydney, Australia, even Taiwan, even New Zealand, some parts of Madagascar, and even some portions of the East Coast and West Coast of America are included in the temperate Köppen climate classification. Okay, because they are now experiencing here the 4 seasons and the temperature is not very high and at the same time not very low. Then after the temperate, the next one, there is now the presence of the continental. Okay, in the case of the continental region or the continental classification of weather, it is now the point when majority of the locations, just like in the upper portion of the Asian continent, specifically in Russia, then the ones that are actually present on Norway, on Sweden, and even Finland is included here. Even the majority of Canada and upper portion or northern portion of United States, it is now experiencing the continental climate. It is now the point when the temperature is roughly around negative degrees Celsius up to the presence of less than 10 degrees Celsius. So those are actually the common temperatures that are being experienced in these particular locations. So the reason for this for them to be considered as continental since they're actually present on the upper portion of the different continents. So they are considered as continental when it comes to their climate. Then after the continental climate, the most freezing or the coldest, it is now the polar climate. But please don't be misled. Majority of the different polar classification of weather are actually present on the Antarctic and the Arctic Circle. But there are some locations just like the ones that are present here. Specifically, this is the Himalayas, in the Siberian Peninsula, and even in the Andes. These are actually the different locations where the polar climate can still be experienced because of very high altitude and at the same time the presence of polar caps. Yeah, okay. These are now the different locations where we can actually experience here different types of climate. Okay, specifically, if we're going to focus here in our country, there are 4 basic types of climate. Okay, according to the Köppen classification. But for this part of our discussion, we're going to focus first more on the Philippines since the Philippines is actually possessing a total of 4 different types of climates. So in the Philippines, there is type 1, type 2, type 3, and type 4 climates. So type 1 climates are the ones in color blue, type 2, the ones in color green, type 3, the ones in color red, and type 4, the ones that are in color yellow. Okay? So in the case of type 1, which includes Bulacan, NCR, even the provinces of Pampanga, Zambales, Tarlac, and even Bataan, and the entirety of Region 1, Occidental Mindoro, then some parts of Oriental Mindoro, half of Palawan, then half of Panay, and half of Negros. These are now experiencing type 1 climate. Type 1 climate is the one that is legitimately possessing 2 pronounced seasons, the dry and the wet season. Dry season from November to April, while wet season from May to October. And these different locations are actually protected by mountain ranges from the northeast monsoon and the trade winds, but open to the southwest monsoon or habagat. That's the reason why during the months of May to October, we can experience here the habagat season. Okay? Or the habagat time. Then, when it comes to the type 2, it is now the type of climate when there is no dry season and there is a wet season all throughout the year. But the maximum rainfall is happening during the months of November to January. This includes some parts of Region 5, specifically the provinces of Sorsogon, Catanduanes, then Camarines Norte, okay, and even some parts of the island of Samar, the northern tip of the Zamboanga Peninsula, the Caraga, and even the presence of the Sibuyan Island, Siargao, and some parts of Leyte, even some parts of Davao del Norte. These are the different locations na kung saan nga ba matatagpuan natin ang type 2 na climate. These locations are having wet season all throughout the year because of their openness to the northeast and southwest monsoon. So these are also the different locations which are very vulnerable when it comes to different weather disturbances, just like typhoons and even the presence of habagat. Okay? Then, for the type 3, the wet and dry season can hardly be differentiated, and November to April is relatively drier. During the type 3, this is also the location where the altitude is quite high. So just like what you can observe here, a majority of the CAR or the Cordillera Administrative Region is under type 3 weather or type 3 climate. Then the presence of some parts of Oriental Mindoro, specifically Puerto Galera, Calapan, and Nauhan. Then Marinduque, then Romblon, even some parts of Masbate, then upper portion of Negros, half of Cebu, then the presence of Zamboanga Peninsula, some parts of Palawan, then the presence of Capiz, Antique, and even here, the presence of some in the Soxargen region. So these are the different locations where the northeast monsoon, they're actually partly protected, but they are very open to southwest monsoon or habagat. Okay, so those are actually the time when they are quite protected from November to April when amihan is very evident. So those are the drier seasons. But still, when it comes to this particular case, it will always be case-to-case basis depending upon what type of weather disturbances will be available. Then, lastly, for type 4, it is now the point where rainfall is more or less evidently distributed throughout the year. So when it comes to the type 4, the rest of the Philippines is considered to be under the type 4. Specifically the ones that are present here in Batanes and the Babuyan Islands, the presence of Quirino, Isabela, Cagayan, and even Aurora, some parts of Quezon, then some parts of Bicol region, Leyte, Bohol, even the tip of even the tip of Cebu, then the some parts of the Soxargen region, even Sarangani province, then Davao del Sur, Davao del Norte, Davao, the Davao region, majority of the Davao region, and even the other parts of the Zamboanga Peninsula is possessing type 4 climate classification. So, when it comes to the different climate that we simply talked about earlier, there are actually different threats that we might encounter when it comes to the changing climate that is happening around us. There is the presence of the greenhouse effect, global warming, and El Nino and La Nina. I know that majority of you are quite aware of every single one of them, but other than the discussion that I will be providing, I will be adding some possibly documentaries or video clips that you could watch for you to be more aware of the different things that is simply happening whenever we are talking about these different types of climatic change. Okay, let's simply start with the greenhouse effect. So the greenhouse effect, remember, it is the natural way of making our world quite hot for it to sustain the life, for it to sustain the different energy that is coming from the sun. Greenhouse effect is natural. global warming is not. Okay? But if greenhouse effect will continuously happen and it will not be monitored, and at the same time the amount of the different gases will simply take up a lot of heat, global warming will happen, climate change will happen. So the different gases once again that are responsible for the greenhouse effect includes carbon dioxide, water vapor, chlorofluorocarbons, methane, and even nitrous oxide. Just like what is present here, this is an example of a greenhouse. The atmosphere is blanketing us. This is the earth, then this is now the atmosphere. It is being blanketed by the different greenhouse gases, which will actually help to make the temperature inside this greenhouse suitable for life. Because without the presence of greenhouse gas, we are already experiencing ice age, and majority of the organisms on Earth will already be extinct, and even humans might be included on that extinction list. Okay? Then, other than greenhouse effect, there is the continuous problem when it comes to the global warming. There is an estimate that by the year 2050, majority of the low-lying areas, specifically here in our country, will be submerged underwater, just like the province of Bulacan, except obviously the areas of San Jose del Monte. But other than the rising sea levels, the other concern here is the presence of hotter days, which will provide more frequent and in turn severe weather events, just like what we experience when it comes to Bagyong Ulysses and even Bagyong Maria, even Bagyong Yolanda, Bagyong Ondoy. Those are just some of the examples that we already experience and we will still experience if global warming will continue. A lot of people lost their lives. A lot of Philippines died even though we are using the resiliency card. Because if we're going to consider it, Filipinos will never be resilient enough because many of us will die if global warming will continue. So we should take a step when it comes to this particular matter. Okay? And we have the subject environmental science for that. Okay, so always be cautious when it comes to these particular things whenever we are discussing this matter. Remember that every single action that we are doing is very important, not only for yourself but also for Mother Earth. Then, remember that oceans, whenever they are warming, they can cause acidification, or these are now the coral bleaching, and at the same time, the death of a lot of organisms. Other than a lot of pollution that is present in the sea, even coral bleaching will actually happen, and that will affect the amount of fishes, the amount of resources that we can consume in the near future. Sino lang din matatalo? Tayo lang din. Humans. Your generation. The future generation. Okay? So we should start acting now. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And one of them is climate action. So we should take a stand when it comes to this particular matter. And lastly, when it comes to my discussion, there's now the presence of El Nino and La Nina. So when it comes to El Nino, it is now the presence of the drought or the very dry season. While in the case of La Nina, it is now the opposite of drought, which is now the presence of severe rain. So in the case of El Nino and La Nina, they are not actually happening simultaneously, but rather then it is happening once every decade, but now it's more frequent. Just like what is simply happening in our country, it is declared by Pag-asa that La Nina is already present, or it is already the La Nina season here in our country. So we should expect more precipitation and the heavier storms, thunderstorms, and even other weather disturbances that will affect every single one of us. Well, in the case of drought, specifically El Nino, this actually started when it comes to the observations that were done on the ocean currents that are actually present in the Pacific Ocean that is traveling from Peru up to the Philippines. So those are actually some of the reasons why it is named as El Nino, because it is happening usually during the time of the Christmas season. Okay, specifically during the bird months. That's the start of El Nino when it comes to some locations across the Pacific. So basically, these are the different things that I would like to discuss to every single one of you, and I am hoping that you will take action when it comes to the climate that is happening or changes in the climate that is happening in our country and that is happening in our world. Taking a step back will actually help us to move forward for the future generation. Climate action is one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals set by the United Nations that we should achieve by the year 2030. So we should take a stand when it comes to this particular matter. Help Mother Nature heal. If not, we will die. A lot of people will die. If it is not you, it will be other people that you know. And we should not wait for that to happen. Simulan na natin ngayon. Okay, so I guess that's all for the meantime, and thank you for gracing this video presentation. And once again, just like how I usually end my podcast, haynayan, magpakailanman. Paalam!